everybody. So thank you very much, James. IBM, Phil. So when he said we got 1 million of these things, I think anybody else, it's going to be hyperbole, and IBM is probably true. Anyway, Ecclesiastes principle. So this is a title of a talk. This comes from something that a friend of mine, Simon Phipps, said, coined from Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And, you know, it's very easy for us in the tech industry to think of ourselves as frontiersmen. We're kind of going boldly where no one has gone before. We're building new stuff, doing things the way that nobody has ever done it before. So we don't have anything to learn from the past. And yet, you know, everywhere we go, there are signs that people have been there before us. You know, at the end of the day, like villages in the mountains, right? At the end of the day, we are people working together to build stuff. And people have been working together to build stuff for a really, really long time. So I like to read a lot of stuff. I like to read a lot of, try and learn from a lot of different areas. And, you know, some things like The Art of War, The Prince, you know, kind of the way that diplomacy has worked. And anyway, I picked 3 examples specifically for today, and I'm going to keep it relatively short. One is from the domain of architecture, another from city planning, and then finally one from diplomacy. So in the architecture, Christopher Alexander, The Oregon Experiment, series of books, awesome series of books written in the 70s. The first of them was a pattern language. The idea behind a pattern language was Christopher Alexander et al., right? There are 5 or 6 authors here. The idea was to give a vocabulary to architects that would allow them to communicate certain architecture elements and design elements to their clients. It wasn't to create patterns, it was to codify existing practice, right? And you know, some of the things that, you know, people live together in these spaces, and so some of the lessons from the pattern language have been really useful to me in terms of, you know, designing software and also working in communities. I'm a community manager like Dawn, and it's been a theme, you know, coming through here is that there's stuff we can learn. So one of the patterns is the intimacy gradient. It's one that I like to think of in terms of, you know, how people interact with a community. So the idea behind the intimacy gradient is that buildings that are well designed have a kind of a gradient of space from public through semi-public, semi-private, and then finally private, intimate space. So for example, this is my house. I live near Lyon in France, and this is like a typical house that you would have in France, right? So about 120 square meters, 1,200 square feet, 3 bedrooms, although it's different now. But anyway, this is our design. And if you overlay an intimacy gradient on it here, right, so you've got the front gate, and outside that is public space, and then you've got the garden, which is kind of less intimate, and then you've got a terrace, which is kind of walled off. And then you get into the living area, the garage, and the living area, living space. And then finally, you've got, on the most intimate area of the house, you've got bedrooms and bathrooms and so on. So the house kind of naturally goes, you naturally move from one level of intimacy to another. You don't want people going through, for example, a bedroom to get to the living room when they're coming into your house. It's kind of inconvenient. And I've been in flats where, you know, you walk in the front door of the flat and you've got like 3 bedrooms there, and then you've got to walk down a hall, which feels really intimate to get to the living area. And communities have their intimacy gradient as well, right? So you've got your public resources, things like mailing list, website, IRC channel. Now you've got your semi-public areas where, you know, you expect people to introduce themselves and know maybe a developer mailing list or you know, people identify themselves. They don't interact anonymously with the community. And then finally, you've got the semi-private and private person-to-person communications. And all of these are important in a community. And it's important that you don't skip steps. So for example, if you have to send a private email to somebody to join a mailing list, then you're breaking the intimacy gradient. And it's important to think about these things. Second example from city planning, Jane Jacobs is awesome. Right? She's a really interesting character as well. So she's a generalist. I know in her education she studied things like zoology, geology, and not at all city planning. And she said, you know, when I got to college, my grades finally improved to the point where they considered, you know, putting me in a college. And then I wouldn't have been able to take all these elective courses. I would have had to follow the program of that college. Luckily, my grades were so bad before then that they decided I was a lost cause and I could continue getting an education. Anyway, so she kind of came up the ranks of city planning in the 50s, 40s and 50s actually, when a woman was like, she was a unicorn. She was a very, very, very special case there. There were basically no women in that area. And she rose up through the ranks and became a very, very well respected city planner. She emigrated to Canada so that her sons could avoid the draft in the 70s. So very, very, the 60s, I guess. Very interesting character. Anyway, one of the things in this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that she talks, there's also a series, right? She talks about the economies of cities, the way that economies develop, and the way that good cities develop, this kind of vibrant renewal of their activities around them. But in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she talks about healthy neighborhoods, what makes a good neighborhood. And one of the things that she points out is that good neighborhoods have mixed primary uses. Right? So if you live in, for example, a US city, it's not unusual to have, you've got your shopping centers in one place, so your shopping area, then you've got your business center in another place, and you've got your residential areas that are outside the city, right? The kind of the classic green city. And those cities generally are not very nice places to live, to be quite frank. You've got traffic is a hell because everybody's on the freeway at the same time going from the residential areas to the working areas. You go to the shopping areas and it's all soulless, big name brands, and you don't have the small commerces. You don't have the kind of the vibrant cultural, kind of the small shops, the niche vendors that you get in places like Shoreditch, because there's never enough people there, right? If people are going from one place to another and you've got the residential areas are all deserted between 9 to 5, the business areas are all deserted on the weekend, and so you don't have that constant churn of people being there. So this kind of mixed primary uses, so mixing the residential and the shopping and the business, mixing them all together is what makes a neighborhood, one of the things that makes a neighborhood great. And in open source projects, we also need to kind of think of this mix all of the time. Right? If your project is completely volunteer-driven or completely professional-driven, then you're missing out because, for example, a 100% professional community is going to be dead in the evenings and on the weekends, right? And that's no good if you want to use this for personal use and you go to the IRC channel at 8 o'clock in the evening because that's when you get home from work and that's when you have time, and there's nobody there because everybody has left at 6 p.m., right, or whatever, right? So that mix of amateur and professional community members is very important. Also, you need to think of geographical diversity, not just because the geographical diversity also brings flexibility in terms of internationalization and localization into your software, but also because you avoid real-time meetings because the guy in Australia has to be up at 3 a.m. to attend your meeting, right? And another thing is that things get used in kind of unusual ways, right? Software gets used, anybody who's been around in the 80s will know what this photo is. Anyway. Software gets used in ways that it was never designed to be used, right? And everything actually gets used in ways that it was never designed to be used if it's a successful design. And so having that ability to have mixed uses of your software makes sure that the software design stays supple, adapts with the evolving needs of your users, and it's also important. So the third area, negotiation theory, diplomacy, is another area where I have learned a lot and use it a lot in working with communities. This book, Getting to Yes, is one of a series of books from the Harvard Negotiation Project. Difficult Conversations is another. There are a series of them. I was turned on to this by David Eves, who is, he's Canadian, and he came into the open source world because I believe he was a friend of the executive director of the Mozilla Foundation, and Mozilla Foundation guy got him to come. I think it was Frank. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I could get it wrong, and only a half a dozen people would know. Anyway, so he was invited to come to consult for the Mozilla Foundation because he works on diplomacy and government interaction and open data, and they said, we need help on figuring out how to do this community stuff better. And he said it was eye-opening. He's been an open source fan for years, and the most successful projects, he says, are good at all. The most successful contributors to projects and the most successful projects are the ones that cultivate the soft skills. And it's something of a theme that we've seen running through this conference, I think, is that all the problems that we have are often they're not technological problems, right? They're people problems. They're communication issues. They're people having difficulty working together to get stuff done. I think it was Theo said. What did you say? Good decision making comes from experience, and experience comes from bad decision making. So anyway, we're always kind of learning. And so Harvard Negotiation Project was founded in the 70s. It's been used in things like Camp David peace accords, in the Israel-Egypt conflict in the 70s. So the idea is you get away from the typical negotiation, like the how much is this gourd seen in the life of Brian, right? One guy says, I'll give you this price, and the other guy says, I want that much for it, and then you kind of haggle until you get to some kind of acceptable middle ground. That's a bad negotiation. Both people come away unhappy. They both feel like they've been robbed, and really the goal of a good negotiation, and one of the reasons I like it, is that you get away from this kind of positions, and you start concentrating on interests. So this is the way, like, negotiation theory, and I could talk about this for an hour. But the idea is that instead of concentrating on how much you want for it, you say, well, why do I want this thing? What are my interests involved in this? You come into the conversation knowing what you want to get out of it fundamentally, not superficially. And then from that fundamental, what I want to get out of this, you've got more options, right? It opens the door. And each of those options can be evaluated against some kind of legitimacy criteria. Is this legally acceptable? Is it something that's within regulations or whatever? So that's the discussion space, and then outside that discussion space, what really dictates the success of the negotiation is the relationship that the people have and how strong that relationship is and how well they communicate together. Okay, so that's like the 1 minute overview of negotiation theory, and everything in open source is a negotiation, right? If it's a discussion on a mailing list, it's a negotiation. I open a bug, that's starting a negotiation. I say, this is important to me, and I'd like to see this fixed, and then the developer has to decide what the priority is and so on. Patch review, feature priority, conflict resolution, everything that we deal with in open source projects is at some point in negotiation, and one of the difficulties is that the relationships involved are quite weak, and the communication media that we have suck. So negotiation theory and thinking about things in terms of the empathy that you can have, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, thinking about the way that these discussions become negotiations is something I think has been very useful to me. Anyway, it's just a small selection of some of the diverse areas where I've learned things as an open source community guy. So I'm done.